This story is going to take your breath away, and not in a good way, in a way that makes you angry, makes you sorrowful, might even make some of you sick to your stomach. This is a very tough story to tell, but it's a necessary one. It's necessary because we have to tell our stories of what we endured, of what we survived. And what the Black girl I'm going to tell you about in this video endured cannot stay hidden. Injustice cannot have her story. Brutality cannot have her truth. That belongs to her. And now to us. We carry her story now, with care and with courage. This is the third story in the series I've been doing called No Escape: How Black People Could Not Escape Injustice. In the first video, I told you about Thomas Smith. 5,000 white people went to war with each other just to lynch him for something that everyone knew he didn't even do. In the second video, I told you about the Wade family. In 1954, they tried to buy a home in a white neighborhood. And for that, their home was bombed. They were arrested. And the people who helped them purchase the home were sentenced to 15 years in prison. In this video, I'm going to tell you about a Black girl who could not escape injustice. She did everything right, and still, injustice came for her. I want to give you a warning right now about this story. What I'm going to talk about in this video is going to be difficult to hear. So please, brace yourself. Take a breath. Some of you may even need to pause the video and come back later. That's perfectly fine. I just ask that you finish watching. Finish it for this Black girl who endured this. Remember, we are telling this story for all the Black women and Black girls who could not tell their stories themselves, who were silenced in shame. But not today, because today is Truth-Telling Day. And I'm going to do something that I normally don't do. I'm going to encourage you to watch this video all the way to the end, because there are some things that I'm going to talk about in parts of this story that you won't expect. Truths that I didn't even see coming when I first learned about it. So do me a favor, watch this video, because the things I'm going to tell you, they won't make sense unless you hear the entire story. Black girls and women have never been safe, never been valued. I've talked about this before. I've told you stories of Black women and girls who were treated as if they were not even human, who were violated, who lost their lives, all because someone wanted their body, and their no was not honored, not respected. It was discarded and completely thrown away. Jim Crow never saw Black women as deserving, not of dignity, not of respect or of valuing. He would inflict brutality upon her with ease and with glee, but let the slightest offense be done to a white woman, and he responded with unspeakable horror. There's a story I told you a while ago that I think really reveals the roots of what we're dealing with here today. It was in a video about a Black teen named L.Q. Ivy. He was a 17-year-old Black boy who was tortured and burned alive in front of thousands in 1925 Mississippi after he was falsely accused of attacking a white woman. People believe the woman made the story up as an excuse to cover up for one of her many affairs. I bring up LQ's story here because just a few weeks later in North Carolina, a young Black girl was attacked and violated by a white man. He confessed to the crime. This man was not lynched. In fact, nothing happened to him. When he came to court, the judge let him go with a warning. That's right, a warning. The Chicago Defender wrote about this, and it said that the law encouraged these attacks on Black women by forgetting Black women and Black girls and making heroes out of their attackers. It was that warning in 1925 that continued to send the message that Black women and girls are here for the taking. Don't worry about the consequences. Lynch mobs will never touch you. The law will protect you. Keep doing what you're doing. Between 1925 and 1959, when this story takes place, an untold number of Black women and girls suffered because of that encouragement, because of that warning. They lost their lives because of it. They suffered because of it, were brutalized because of it. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were never told, but their pain was real. And it was allowed because of that warning that was given. That warning that encouraged infliction of pain. The warning that excused brutality. And because of that warning and that encouragement, the young Black girl I'm about to tell you about in this video suffer an unspeakable injustice. Betty Jean Owens was born around 1940. We believe in Florida. I say believe because we don't know much about her life. We don't know who she was before May of 1959. Unfortunately, all we know is the pain and the aftermath. But even though we don't know everything, we still give her dignity. We still honor her. From news reports after the event, we know she was one of at least 3 children to her mother and her father. The fall of 1958 was supposed to be the start of the next chapter of her life, adulthood. She enrolled at Florida A&M University, also known as FAMU, a storied historically black college in Tallahassee, Florida. It was the Jim Crow South, but she was around her people, and she thought she was safe. Then, May 2nd, 1959 came around. That night in Tallahassee, 4 men made a pact with one another, a brutal one rooted in racism. They said tonight would be the night they went out and got a black girl and had an all-night party, Jim Crow style. And the word they used was not black. It was another word, one I can't and won't say here. These men made their intentions clear. They weren't looking for dates with black women. They were looking to take something that did not belong to them, something they were not going to ask for. They intended to take this by force, and that was the body of a black girl. Their names were 24-year-old Ted Collinsworth, a telephone lineman, 20-year-old Patrick Scarborough, an Air Force airman, 18-year-old David Beagles, a senior at Leon High School, and 16-year-old Ollie Stoudemire. 4 white males with different ages and different jobs, but the same shared belief that black women's bodies were theirs to use. At the same time these men were making their pact, 19-year-old Betty Jean Owens and her girlfriend, 17-year-old Edna Richardson, and their dates, 18-year-old Richard Brown and 18-year-old Thomas Butterfield, were attending FAMU's Orange and Green Ball. It was supposed to be a good time. They were dressed to the nines in their evening gowns and tuxedos. Betty's gown was especially fancy. It was all white with gold flowers. She wore white gloves with it and gold-heeled slippers. They had fun, danced the night away. Afterwards, the 4 of them drove to Gaither Park to relax and hang out. It was around 1 a.m. They had only been there for about 15 minutes when their fun turned into a nightmare, one that Betty would think about for the rest of her life. A night that was supposed to be hers was taken from her, and so was the peace that came along with it. The 4 white men drove around in their 1959 blue Chevrolet, looking in the black section of town, trying to find their victim. They spotted a car with 4 black teens in it. Aaron Gaines Jr. was driving. In the car with him were 2 girls and 2 other boys. The white men thought they had their targets. Their fun was about to begin. They chased after Gaines, trying to overtake his car and stop him. Gaines raced to one of the girls' homes and pulled up. That's when the men jumped out, armed with their weapons, ready to begin their fun with the black girl. But when one of the girls' mothers came outside, one of the white men got spooked and they decided to leave. But they were not done, not at all. They went back out, hunting. Meanwhile, Betty Jean Owens and her friends were still at the park, sitting in the car, laughing and talking and having a good time. That's when the 4 white men saw them. They decided they would try again. But this time, they would be successful in their heinous intention. The 4 white men, armed with firearms and switchblades, slowly crept upon Betty and her friends. Patrick Scarborough shoved a weapon in the driver, Richard Brown's face, pressing it against his nose. He ordered them all to get out of the vehicle. At first, Betty and her friends hesitated, not knowing what was about to happen. They then reluctantly got out of the vehicle. That's when Scarborough forced Richard and Thomas to kneel on the ground. As he did this, David Beagles pointed his knife at Betty and at Edna and told them not to move and not to say a word. Betty and Edna were terrified. Betty began to cry. And for this, Beagles slapped her and told her to shut up or she'd never get back home. That's when Scarborough waved his weapon and told Richard and Thomas to get back in the car and to leave. They were going to keep Betty and Edna there with them. Thomas and Richard did as they were told. They got back in the car and they slowly drove away. Betty and Edna were left alone with these 4 white men, not knowing what was about to happen, but also knowing what was likely going to happen, knowing that it involved them and it was not going to end well. Now, let me say this before I continue. Please resist the urge to say what you would have done. This was 1959 in Florida, a state that had the highest rate of lynching in the country. Lynches weren't history then. There were headlines. There were Saturdays. There were warnings. There were real events that people talked about. Victims were your family members and your neighbors. Jim Crow was not an idea. He was in the air every day. None of us knows what we would have done if we had lived under the weight of that fear. So don't judge them from 60 years away. They lived in a world we only visit in stories like this. As Thomas and Richard drove away, Edna saw an opportunity to escape. The men were distracted, trying to figure out which one of them would go first, who would begin the brutality. Edna ran towards a nearby park, leaving Betty alone with the four men. Betty screamed out for Edna not to leave her. This only angered the men more. Betty asked them what they were going to do with her. David Beagles took his knife and pressed it against Betty's throat. He told her they would let her go if she simply lay down and let them do what they wanted. They forced her to get on her knees. Then they slapped her as she cried out in fear and horror. One of them was going to do the act right there, but another one stopped him. Not here, he said. Not because he had a conscience, but because he wanted to take his time. And he couldn't do that there. Do you remember how this night started? 4 black teens, freshmen at a HBCU, going to a ball, dressed in their finest clothing, just wanting to have a good time. But good old Jim Crow wouldn't allow that. He was always lurking around the corner, ready to disrupt and terrorize at any moment. And here was Betty, in the back of that car, crying and alone. No one coming to help, no one to save her, surrounded by 4 white men who were armed and violent. They'd already beaten Betty. What was Betty thinking in that moment? What went through her mind? We don't know exactly, but we know her thoughts were racing. A million thoughts going a million miles an hour, trying to figure a way out, trying to think of anything that might keep her alive. Even though Betty's friends, Richard and Thomas, drove away, they did not leave. They didn't abandon Betty and Edna. They drove around the corner and they waited. When they saw the blue Chevy leave, they quickly drove back to where they left the girls. Once there, they got out and they looked for them, but they saw no one. Edna was hiding and she saw them. She called out to them and she ran to their car. She told them that the 4 white men had driven off with Betty. The 3 of them then rushed to the police station to try to find help. That night, 19-year-old Leon County Deputy Sheriff Joe Cook Jr. was on duty. He was a student at Florida State University, interning with the sheriff's office, and it was his first solo shift. The 3 teens saw Cook and flagged him down. They told him what happened, told him that 4 white men had taken Betty. They didn't think he would believe them. They didn't think he would do anything. But to their surprise, he immediately agreed to help them. Cook also informed his superiors. Soon, other sheriff's deputies and the Tallahassee police and highway patrol officers were all looking for Betty. Richard and Thomas got into the police car with Deputy Cook, and the 3 of them set out to find her. They had a description of the car and they had a description of the men, but they did not know where they had gone. Meanwhile, as the police were looking for Betty, she was driven to a remote part of town off Orange Avenue. Once there, the men got Betty out of the car, still holding their weapons on her. Betty was crying. She was terrified. She knew what they wanted, and she knew who they wanted, and that was her. And there was nothing she could say or do that was going to get them to leave her alone. Before I go any further, I need to pause here, because this next part is going to be difficult to hear. I'm warning you right now. What I'm going to tell you is heavy, it's graphic, and it's hard to carry. But as hard as it is to hear, it was even harder to live through, harder to survive, harder to speak of, and harder to remember. And Betty Jean Owens had to live it. So I'm asking you to stay with me, to bear witness and not to look away. We're not telling this story for shock value. We're telling it for truth, for dignity, and for justice. And we're telling it because so many stories like this were never told. Because so many black women never got the chance to be believed. So as we go into this next part, just take a breath and remember why we're here. Betty begged the men not to do this. She pleaded with them, but they did not care. Beagle slapped Betty, told her to lie on the ground. The men began to pull her nightgown and her underwear off. As they yanked her clothes off, she begged and she begged, and Beagle struck her again. After that, they violated her, over and over again, taking turns. In all, 7 times. She begged them to stop, just to let her go. But they didn't do that. Instead, they laughed, and they cheered each other on, acted as if Betty wasn't even there. She wasn't a person to them, just an object to be used for their satisfaction. But she was there. She experienced every second of it. She breathed through every second, had thoughts through every single second. Betty remembered that during the first round, they each watched intently, focusing on every aspect of this horror show. They stood around her in a circle, watching as each had their turn. But by the second round, they seemed to lose interest. All but Collinsworth violated her twice. This went on for 3 hours, and Betty remained on the ground the entire time. They never let her get up until they were done. I don't know about you, but this literally took my breath away when I read it. I even struggled saying it to you just now. I had to record this part a few times because each time I started, I had to stop because my mind went there to 1959, to that moment. And all I could think about was Betty and the fear and the terror. This was someone's child, someone's sister, someone's friend. And here she was, experiencing something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Betty went to FAMU, the HBCU. I went to a HBCU. And one of the great things about going to a HBCU is that for a moment, during class and on campus or in the dorms with your friends, you were not black. You see, racism makes you black when you leave the house. It puts that classification on you. It puts demands on you, on your body and on your spirit. But in the HBCU, everyone around you is black. That unjust classification of race, it doesn't exist there. And just for a few moments, you and your classmates can breathe, free from the daily indignities that come along with being black in America. At FAMU, Betty wasn't black. She was just Betty. But when those 4 white men saw her, she became black. A black woman who was not deserving. A black woman for whom the word no meant nothing. A black woman who could not feel pain, who could not be harmed, who could not be violated, because to them, she was there for that purpose, for their gratification. In the insular world of FAMU, Jim Crow walked in, and he reminded everyone there was no place he could not go, no place he could not find you, no place he could not hurt you. There was no escape. 3 hours later, after the men were done with Betty and they had their fun, they blindfolded her with a cloth diaper. They gagged her and they bound her hands and they threw her on the floorboard of the car. They then drove off. Deputy Cook, Richard, and Thomas were still looking for Betty. It was around 4 a.m. when one of them finally spotted the blue Chevy. They shouted to Deputy Cook. That was the car. Those were the men who took Betty. Deputy Cook quickly turned on his lights and his sirens and tried to pull the car over. But the 4 white men wouldn't stop. Seeing the police behind them, they took Deputy Cook on a high-speed chase. They knew they couldn't be found with Betty in the car like that. Deputy Cook chased them all over Tallahassee at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour. As they tried to get away, one of the men said that they should dump Betty's car, to which another one said they couldn't because the police were too close on their tail. Now, this tells us something. It tells us that they had plans to get rid of Betty, to discard her like she was nothing. After the attack, Betty had to muster the strength to make her attackers believe that she forgave them. It was the only way she believed that she could make it out of this alive, because there were plans to take her life. Now, remember that part about taking her life, about throwing her away. It's going to be important later in this story. Deputy Cook was finally able to pull the car over. He drew his pistol on the men, but the 4 white men weren't ready to give up just yet. Collinsworth grabbed his weapon and got out, almost like he was ready to shoot it out. Cook told the men that he would take them all out if they didn't drop their weapons and line up against the car. Cook notified his supervisors of where he was and waited for backup. But there was still one question. Where was Betty Jean? Then, from inside the blue Chevy, Cook heard muffled screaming. When he looked to see what it was, he saw Betty Jean Owens, bound and gagged, and lying on the floorboard of the back seat. Her friends, Richard and Thomas, rushed to her aid. They helped her out of the car. But Betty Jean was so battered and so beaten that as soon as her feet hit the ground, she collapsed. Once backup arrived, the 4 men were taken into custody. Deputy Cook drove Betty and her friends to the Black Hospital at Florida A&M. Back at the scene, Sheriff Raymond Hamlin and Deputy Sheriff W.W. Slappy arrested the 4 men. None of them saw anything wrong with what they had done. They just assumed they'd be going home. As Deputy Slappy drove them to the police station, the 4 men laughed and joked about what they had just done. Slappy told them this was no laughing matter, that they were facing the electric chair. And while they were laughing, on their way to the jail, Betty was crying, sobbing uncontrollably on her way to the hospital. Police later remembered that her face was covered in tears. Her arms were quivering. She was still in shock, still scared. Once she arrived at the hospital, they took her straight to the operating room. All 4 men admitted what they had done to her, but they didn't just say it. Once they got to the police station, each of them wrote out a confession, admitting to kidnapping Betty Jean, pulling weapons on her, and then having sex with her. Sheriff Hamlin asked the men if they wanted to review their statements, to make sure everything was accurate, to make any additions or corrections. And that's when David Beagles read through his statement and smiled and said that he had just one minor correction to make. The men were formally charged the next day. Once news spread of what happened to Betty, anger and outrage erupted. Papers all across the country carried the story. And back in Tallahassee, students at FAMU took action. It sent shockwaves through the campus that something like this could happen. FAMU students protested in support of Betty. Student President Clifford Taylor said that they wanted the world to know that they were disturbed by what happened, and that they were deeply concerned about this happening to black women on campus. That something had to be done, because what happened to Betty wasn't just an attack on one black woman. It was an attack on all of them. On May 3rd, just hours after the attack, when Betty was still in the hospital, FAMU students came together for a unity rally in her support. 1,500 students packed into Lee Auditorium and demanded action. The next day, they came back again. On the school's quad, they brought signs, they sang hymns, and they prayed for Betty. Some signs said, "It could have been your sister, your wife, or your mother." Others said, "My God, how much more can we take?" And that really was the question. How much more? How many more lynchings? How many more segregated water fountains? How much more injustice, pain, and suffering? How much were black people supposed to take and just move on? How many more Betty Jean Owens had to suffer? Officials in Tallahassee took notice of the student activism and the wave of support for Betty. On May 6, Judge W. May Walker convened a grand jury to investigate. Betty was still in the hospital at this time, not only recovering from her physical injuries, but also in a complete state of mental shock. She was brought from the hospital to the Leon County Courthouse to testify in front of the grand jury. She was accompanied by her mother, her brother, a nurse, and the hospital administrator. Betty was in such distress and such mental anguish that she had to be given medication just to be able to come and testify. She braved the fear to tell the grand jury what they had done to her. After testifying, she was taken straight to the hospital. The 4 men were still in custody at this time. The grand jury quickly returned the indictments against all 4 men. They were taken to court the next day to be arraigned. And in that courtroom, they pleaded not guilty. Black people in the balcony gasped. They howled. They could not believe what they were hearing, that these men would deny what they did to Betty. Judge Walker ordered the 4 men to be held in custody while awaiting trial. And that was a first. That was the first time in Florida history that white men had been held in jail before trial after being accused of violating a black woman. Around the country, black leaders spoke out about what happened in Florida. In his weekly editorial in the New Pittsburgh Courier, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, wrote that there will be no justice under the American flag if these men were not found guilty and punished. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Tallahassee just a few days after the attack. He praised the FAMU students for their activism and called for justice to be done. And black people had every right to be skeptical that justice would come for Betty, because in the eyes of Jim Crow, black women were not respected. Their pain was not honored. It was seen as something to laugh at. And I mean that literally. That same month that Betty was violated, another black woman, 25-year-old Mary Ruth Reed, was in a courtroom in Union County, North Carolina. She was testifying before a jury about how, when she was 7 months pregnant, a white man named Lewis Metlin broke into her home, he beat her, and violated her in front of her 5 children. The jury laughed as she testified. And then they found him not guilty. That's what Jim Crow thought about black women. Her violation wasn't victimization. Her trauma could be discarded. She did not matter. Black women's suffering was not a laughing matter. But this gives you insight into the mind of Jim Crow and all of those who follow his ideology, that black pain was excusable, that the infliction of injustice was to be tolerated, no matter how horrific, no matter how ghastly. It was all okay in his eye. The 4 white men who attacked Betty will be tried just 1 month later. Under Florida law, their crime was punishable by death, by electrocution. But it remained to be seen whether a Florida jury would be willing to hand down that punishment to 4 young white men. At the time, no white person had ever been executed for violating a black woman. 1 white man had been electrocuted for violating a white woman, and in the previous 25 years, 37 black men had been electrocuted after being convicted of violating a white woman. And that doesn't even count the lynchings in Florida. So this was a real question. What would this jury do? What would justice look like for Betty Jean Owens? The trial began on Wednesday, June 10th, 1959, just over 1 month after Betty was attacked. The state was represented by State's Attorney William Hopkins. The 4 men were represented by attorneys S. Gunter Toney, John Rudd, and Harry Michaels. As you can imagine, the jury was all white and all male. The prosecution's star witness was Betty Jean. She had a story that only she could tell. She knew what happened. She knew the truth. And once again, she braved her fear. She braved the shame and the humiliation that was never hers to carry in the first place. She came to court to testify. Betty told the jury exactly what happened, how she was kidnapped, terrorized, and violated for hours. She told them that she was afraid, told them about the pain, told them how she was injured. She testified that she couldn't use her arm or a leg for days after the attack because of the position she was forced to stay in for hours on the ground. She described the bruise that had been left on her breast, where the bodice of her dress had dug into her skin over hours of the men pressing their bodies on hers. She told them everything, every horrific detail. She held nothing back. But neither did the men's attorneys. They pulled from Jim Crow's playbook for the defense. They used the 3 Ds often seen in a Jim Crow trial. They discredited Betty's version of events. They destroyed her character, and they demeaned her integrity. A strategy designed to play directly into the racial biases of Southern juries. They depicted Betty as a Jezebel. I've talked about this before in a previous video, so I won't go too deep into it here. But the Jezebel lie and the stereotype behind it was born out of slavery. The black women were naturally promiscuous, hypersexual, always willing and always wanting it. This lie did more than distort the truth. It served 2 purposes. It absolved white men of their guilt and stripped black women of their right to bodily autonomy. It painted them as participants, even in their own violation. And defense attorneys often use it to get juries to let attackers go free. And in Betty's case, they did it again. The same strategy, same lie, same attempt to strip her of her dignity. The defense attorneys held nothing back. Their defense was simple. Betty wanted it. She was never violated. She consented. They cross-examined Betty on why she never tried to flee, why she didn't run. And Betty told them plainly, where was I supposed to go? They had weapons. They had beaten her. She was afraid for her life. There was nowhere to run. After that, they accused her of wanting it, of consenting to being with 4 men that she had never met. The defense cross-examined Betty for over an hour. They asked her, didn't you enjoy it? Didn't you get pleasure from this? They even questioned her about her virginity, but Betty refused to answer that question. All of this was designed to attack her credibility, to imply that she wanted it, that she was promiscuous. Now, let me step into my lawyer role for just 1 second. My day job is as a litigator and a trial lawyer, and I've questioned and cross-examined hundreds of people. Sometimes I've had to ask hard questions. I've had to press people on their stories, and it can get intense. People get emotional. So I understand hard cross-examination, but that's not what this is, because running beneath these questions was something else: racism and injustice. It was a belief that Betty Jean and all black women were nothing, that her blackness meant she could not have been violated, that her black womanhood meant that she was deserving of what she got, that there was no pain, just pleasure. And that's what made those questions roll so easily off their tongues. They didn't hesitate because they knew those words would resonate with the jury, just like they had so many times before. The prosecution also called Deputy Slappy. He told the jury how the man confessed to what they did and how they showed no remorse, how they were laughing and joking. Defense attorneys accused him and others of coercing the confessions out of the men. Deputy Cook, who rescued Betty, he also testified. They accused him of seeking media attention from Northerners. Another witness took the stand, Jimmy Cooper, a former high school classmate of David Beagle's. He told the jury that David told him just hours before Betty was abducted that he was going to get a black girl. He didn't use the word black either. He used another word. But Cooper said that David Beagle shared with him his plan for that night. The prosecution also called doctors who examined Betty to confirm that she had been attacked. And Betty's friends also testified. Edna, Thomas, and Richard. They took the stand to tell the jury what happened that night. Once the prosecution rested their case, it was time for the defense to put on theirs. All of the men testified except for 16-year-old Ollie. David Beagle said that he was being set up. All the men maintained that what happened that night was consensual, and they had an explanation for everything. The weapons they brought, they claimed that it was because they were looking for black men who had parked in the neighborhood and were bothering them. David Beagles admitted that he did pull a switchblade on the 14s, but said that he put it away once he saw that they were dressed up. As for why he told Richard and Thomas to leave, he admitted that he did that, but he claimed that he asked Betty and Edna to get in the car and they got in voluntarily. He never forced them. The attorneys tried to get the confessions thrown out, but Judge Walker denied their request. So they pivoted. They claimed the men were coerced, claimed that they were all drunk and didn't know what they were signing. But Collinsworth's defense stood out the most. It was over the top and all too familiar. First, he brought his wife in, Pearlie, to testify on his behalf. She told the jury that he wasn't himself when he drank, but that when he was sober, he was a great husband and father. But she also admitted that he beat her. But still, that wasn't the most outrageous part. Collinsworth claimed that he was insane. Now, I know it sounds far-fetched, but this was actually a common defense back then. White men used this when they were accused of violating a black woman or a black girl. In 1933, a white man named Glenn Sampson attacked a young black girl. Instead of convicting him, the judge declared him insane and said that a white man of such high standing would never do something like that to a black girl unless he was out of his mind. And if you remember the story I told you about Hattie McRae, the 14-year-old black girl who lost her life after refusing the advances of a white police officer, that officer also claimed that he was insane. He was sent to a mental institution. So Collinsworth figured he'd try the same thing, but he went even further. He didn't just say he was insane. He claimed that it was because he was part Indian. Before the trial, his attorneys requested a sanity test, and Judge Walker granted it. In that trial, they leaned into their racism. They played to the jury's biases, not just against black people, but also against Native Americans too. They argued that Collinsworth had Indian blood raging through his veins, that it made him prone to violence and he was unstable. They even brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. W.M.C. Wilhoit. He testified and told the jury that individuals of the Indian race reacted violently and primitively when psychotic or intoxicated. That was their defense. That was their justification for what they did to Betty Jean Owens. When it came to the closing arguments, the prosecution put it simply to the jury. Prosecutor Hopkins said that, suppose two colored boys and their moron friends attacked a white girl, had taken her from a car and forced her into a secluded place, and regardless of whether they secured her consent or not, had intercourse with her 7 times, leaving her in such bad condition that she collapsed and had to be hospitalized. He said Betty never stood a chance against those 4 armed men. Defense attorneys went in the opposite direction. They blamed outside agitators. They blamed Betty. One of the attorneys used a racial slur. He told the jury, "Are you going to believe this wench over these 4 boys?" And he used a word I'm not going to say before wench when referring to Betty, one often used to refer to black people. The jury got the case around 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, June 13th. They deliberated for 2.5 hours. At 1:30 a.m., they reached their verdict. Guilty as charged, but with a recommendation of mercy, meaning they didn't want the 4 men to be sentenced to death. As the verdict was being read, David Beagle's family was shocked and began crying, almost as if they believed the encounter was consensual, or maybe that what he did didn't deserve punishment because Betty was black. This is an actual courtroom sketch from the trial when the verdict was read. Now, let's talk about that mercy that the jury gave. They granted it because they said there was no brutality involved in this incident. They said that Betty hadn't been beaten or hurt physically, except for the repeated violations. That means they must have forgotten about the foot-long switchblades, the firearms, the violence, and the violations. This was nothing but brutality. But because Betty was black, it was easy to forget about her injuries, her pain, and her suffering. She told them all about it. Every injury, every detail. They just didn't care. After the verdict, Reverend Dr. A. Joseph Reddick, the former NAACP state president in Florida, he said that the verdict was Florida maintaining its fine record of never sending a white man to the electric chair for violating a black woman. That they were able to rest easy knowing that their record remained untouched. Black people across the country were outraged. The Pittsburgh Courier captured the fury that the verdict sparked. How this heinous act had been met with mercy. Mercy that black people were never shown. The Chicago Defender ran a full-page headline on the verdict, making it plain that these men escaped punishment that black men so often receive. The men were all sentenced to life in prison, but this guilty verdict and sentence did not mean justice. The 4 men did go to prison, but all 4 were paroled within 8 years, and 3 of them were returned to prison on other charges. The youngest, 16-year-old Ollie Stoudemire, was paroled in 1965. 20-year-old Patrick Scarborough was paroled in 1966. He would go in and out of jail until 1993, when he was finally convicted of attempted murder. Only then was he sentenced to life in prison. 23-year-old Ted Collinsworth was paroled in 1967, but he went back to prison in 1975 and was paroled again in 1976. As for David Beagles, remember at the beginning of the video, I told you to stay until the end? Well, this is why. 18-year-old David Beagles was paroled in 1965, and just 4 years later, in 1969, he took the life of another young black woman. Her name was Betty Jean Houston. He choked her. He beat her. He shot her in the head. She tried to get away, ran a half a mile after being fired at and struck in the face, but Beagles chased her down and took her life and buried her in a shallow grave. At his trial, Ollie Stoudemire testified that Beagles told him that he planned to take the life of a black woman as revenge for being convicted for violating Betty Jean Owens. And just like 10 years before, an all-white jury once again spared his life. He was given life in prison instead of the death penalty. But justice still did not come. His conviction was overturned in 1974 after an appeals court ruled that the jury should not have seen 81 photographs from the crime scene. At his second trial, Beagles repeated his same story, that he was simply driving down the road and he accidentally hit Betty Jean Houston with his car, and he stopped to see if she was okay. The jury found him not guilty, but the parole board decided to revoke his parole for the 1959 Betty Jean Owens conviction because he fled the county after Betty Jean Houston's body was discovered. He would spend another 16 years in prison before finally being paroled in 1990. Let's pause here for just one moment, because this moment, what I just told you, it matters. It sums up the entire theme we've been exploring in this series, the theme of no escape. Betty Jean Owens could not escape injustice. And 10 years later, Betty Jean Houston could not escape it either. But why? Well, because Jim Crow said that black women did not matter. Jim Crow said that brutality against black women was okay. Jim Crow said no matter what, he would always win. His justice mattered. He was the courts. He was the law. He was the one who decided. And that jury in 1959, they didn't just find David Beagles guilty. They encouraged him. They gave him mercy. And that mercy was the message. It told him that what he did wasn't unforgivable. It told him that he could do it again. And he did. What he did to Betty Jean Houston, that wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a man who just snapped. This was a man who planned, who held onto that hatred, who waited for 10 years. He told people he wanted revenge for being convicted of what he did to Betty Jean Owens. And when he saw another young black woman with the same first and middle name, he made her pay for it. That's not random. That's not a mistake. That's what the Chicago Defender warned us about back in 1925. That the law encourages these attacks. That black women and girls are here for the taking. That was the warning. And this right here, this was the encouragement. When systems don't punish brutality, they permit it. When men get away with violence black women and girls, they believe they are entitled to do it again. David Beagles believed that. And Betty Jean Houston lost her life because of it. But for Jim Crow, Betty Jean Owens would not have lived that nightmare. But for Jim Crow, Betty Jean Houston would not have died in such a horrific way. And but for Jim Crow, all of the other Bettys would not have had to suffer. There's one more part to this story that I haven't told you. Betty Jean Owens became pregnant as a result of the attack. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and just sit with that, because this wasn't just pain. It was devastation. A nightmare that simply would not end. A horror show that just kept repeating and she couldn't turn it off. After everything she had already endured, after the night that changed her life forever, after being violated again and again, her body still had more to carry. Her mind was already holding the weight of the terror and the trauma and the shame that was never hers to carry. And now her body was asked to carry a reminder, a daily growing reminder of what had been done to her. And that's the part that makes this even harder. She didn't even know which one of them was the father, because all four of them had taken turns, because her body had been treated like property. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for her? The horror of realizing you were pregnant with your attacker's child and not even knowing which one, not knowing whose face might appear, whose bloodline might live on through you. That fear, that helplessness, that confusion, that loneliness. She was just 19 years old, and she had just been told by a courtroom that what happened to her deserved mercy, that her body didn't matter enough for justice. Betty could not bear this, but her options were limited because abortion was illegal in Florida. So the prosecutor, William Hopkins, made arrangements for her to travel to New York to have an abortion there. Betty did her best to return to life as a student at FAMU, but it was not the same. She was not the same. Normal was no longer normal. She said she couldn't handle it. She ended up dropping out and moved back home to live with her mother. Eventually, she met her husband, a fellow FAMU student. They married in 1961. They had 4 children and later moved to Michigan, where she got a job there. Betty worked as a teacher's aide and later at a credit union before retiring. But what she carried, what she lived through, was never spoken. Betty hid what happened to her from her children. She never said a word, not for decades. It wasn't until the early 2000s where the truth finally began to surface. Her grandson enrolled at FAMU, and in one of his classes, he heard about the attack. He went home and asked his mother, Betty's daughter. She went online and she read the story, and she learned what happened to her mother. And then she asked Betty, asked her to tell them the truth, what happened. And for the first time in over 40 years, Betty sat all of her children down and told them what happened to her on that night in May of 1959. They were shocked and devastated. They had no idea what their mother had been carrying around for so long. No idea what she had lived through, the shame that she was carrying, that never belonged to her. We don't know what happened to Betty Jean Owens. We don't know if she's alive right now. She only spoke about what happened one time, in 2011. We tell Betty's story today not to spotlight her pain, but to share her truth. To tell the truth of what happened to her and what has happened to so many black women whose names we will never know. Most of the world will never know their stories. And it's that silence, the silence and justice forced upon them, that still echoes across the generations. The silence that excused what black women endured during slavery, that discarded what they suffered during Jim Crow, that still whispers the lie, even today, that black women don't matter. But they do matter. You matter. If you're a black woman watching this video, I want you to know that you matter. The world may not see you. The world may not want to hear what you've been through or what you're still going through, but you matter. Betty Jean Owens mattered. She didn't get justice in 1959, but we give her justice today by remembering, because memory is a form of justice. I'll be back in the next video to close out this series with one more name and one more story of a black person who could not escape injustice. Now it's time to hear from you. Had you ever heard of Betty Jean Owens before today, and was there anything about her story that stuck with you? And how did it make you feel learning about her? Leave me a comment and let me know.